Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to all of you who are here in the room and on Zoom as well. I think it was so moving listening to the Ukrainian national anthem. There's that line in it, we will lay down our souls and our bodies for our freedom. And I think that's really what we're actually seeing in Ukraine today. So my hope is to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of context, some interesting images and stories that will help contextualize what's happening in Ukraine right now. I think it's especially important to talk about Ukraine now. There's already some Ukraine fatigue, right? It's not the first thing on the news websites anymore, but war is still going on and will be, I think, for quite some time. And so I think for those of us who are following Ukraine, who are living the war in our hearts, which is very much how I feel, it's actually right now that we really have to dig in and keep telling the story. Ukraine has been a part of my life since 2005. I wrote a paper in graduate school at Princeton on Ukrainian theater, and that set the ball in motion, and I haven't looked back since. So since then, 17 years ago, I've spent years researching in Ukraine, most recently on a Fulbright. I've seen hundreds of theater productions. I've actually fallen asleep in more than I care to admit. I've read thousands of archival documents. Also, I may have nodded off on some particularly stiflingly hot days in the archives. And I've spent countless hours grappling with the very difficult Ukrainian language. That is not what makes my heart stop when I see the Russians bombing Ukraine. It's my friends. 17 years is a long time to know people. It's through boyfriends, husbands, kids, second husbands. That's most of my adult life that I've been coming to this country, that it's become part of me. One of my best friends, Sophia, lives in Lviv in Western Ukraine. She runs a research center with which I'm affiliated, and she's turned it into a shelter recently. And she's working on ways of recording what is happening, taking oral testimonies and documenting the stories that people are experiencing right now. And one of the things we've been talking about a lot is how to change public opinion on Ukraine. Everyone knows where Ukraine is now, right? That's great. But what you see in the news is, the bombed out city squares, right? And people on sort of the worst day of their life being interviewed on CNN, right? And so where is the beautiful, democratic, utterly normal country with wine bars and theater festivals and great universities that existed before Russia invaded? Why can't people know about that? So my goal today is to give you a better sense of Ukraine, not just as an object of Russia's aggression, but this is my Ukraine. Slide, please. Great. So this is actually the view from my very first apartment in Kiev in 2006, near Maidan Nezalezhnosti. That means Independence Square. So you can sort of see the square in the middle there. This is where revolution had happened in 2004, the Orange Revolution, and would happen again in 2013, 2014. Slide, please. Ukraine for me is also, it's a little dim on the slide, but just imagine it, right? Even more beautiful. This is the beautiful 11th century cathedral, St. Sophia, Sofiyski Sobor, in Kiev, and it's actually where one of my main archives are, so I've spent an extraordinary amount of time there. Next slide, please. Here I am at St. Sophia's in winter with two of my theater friends. That's Ira on the right and Nadia in the middle. And this is right before. Next slide, please. We went back to Nadia's apartment to make kutya, which is sort of the dish actually in the white bowl there. It's like a very rich porridge thing that you make on New Year's for good luck. So they taught me how to make kutya. Both are scholars and activists. Nadia has remained in Kiev, and Ira has gone to Lviv, but is hoping to go back to Kiev. And both of them taught me about theater. Next slide, please. They actually took me on an archival research trip to the Berezil Theater. Here I am in the backstage of this theater. It says Berezil, which is the name of the theater, in 2009. And this is in a city, Kharkiv, which you may have seen on the news. It was bombed a lot in March and sort of the early days of the war. And in fact, what you don't know is that the part of the city that was bombed was this area, the historic city center, with the theaters, the famous buildings. right? The main streets that I knew and loved so much. And in fact, one of the buildings that was bombed was a building called Budynek Slovo, which means the building of the word. And it's where a lot of the people who founded this theater in the 20s actually lived. And they were arrested by the Soviet state and murdered in the 1930s. And then the Russians bombed the building in which they had lived, right? So the resonance was extremely painful. Next slide, please. This is actually the founder of the Berezil Theater, Les Kurbas. This is his hometown in western Ukraine, in a city on a hill, where I was lucky enough to go also in 2009. Next slide, please. And here I am actually celebrating the book that I wrote about him with a glass of wine on a Kiev rooftop in 2017 at a very jazzy book launch. Next slide, please. But other friends helped me understand Ukraine. Nothing is more Ukrainian than a summer music festival. And here I am at the music festival Kraina Mri, or Land of Dreams, with my friend Natalia, her sister Ira, and Natalia's husband, Yosef. Yosef is American, he's a photographer, but from Ukrainian diaspora, and Natalia is Ukrainian. Next slide, please. She taught me how to make borscht. Next slide, please. Here I am several years later with her daughter. She and her now 2 kids, actually, early in the war, were able to escape through Bucharest, Romania, and fly to the United States, where Yosef was, right? He'd left sort of early when things got very, very tense with Russia. So they helped me understand Ukraine. Next slide, please. Kiev is just beautiful. This is a picture of the city in summer from the rooftop of another theater. I realized when I was putting this together, I spent a lot of time on rooftops and in theaters in Ukraine. But I wanted to show how beautiful the city is. Next slide, please. That's not my slide.
What's that? Kiev?
That was Kiev. Okay. That's the capital city. Yeah. So this is actually the city of Lviv, which is in western Ukraine. My mom always jokes that if something goes wrong in Lviv, I can always walk to Poland. So this is also from a rooftop cafe in the city of Lviv. Next slide, please. This is the University of Lviv, where I had my Fulbright. Next slide, please. And this is these are my students that I taught while on my Fulbright in Lviv. Next slide. Here I am teaching at a summer school of Jewish history and culture because Ukraine is also Jews and Jewish history. Next slide, please. Ukraine is also Muslims. This is a mosque on the Ukraine side of what's called the ABL. They don't call it a border with Crimea, right? Because that would presume that it is a separate country. So they call it an administrative boundary line with Crimea. And so Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Crimea who are Muslim, come, they cross the ABL and they come to this mosque to worship because Crimea under Russian occupation has no freedom of religion. And actually most of the Crimean Tatar activists have been arrested and tortured. So people cross the ABL to worship here at this mosque, and it's also a kind of a cultural center. Next slide, please. But Ukraine also has hip avant-garde theater performances. This is a theater performance by a group called Diki Teatr, or Wild Theater, that took place in the Kiev Zoo. Next slide, please. Ukraine also has hipster art exhibits. Next slide. And hipster coffee shops. Next slide. Ukraine also has social justice projects. This is a really great project called Class Act, which is created by a really wonderful playwright and dramaturg, Natalia Voroshby. And she started this in about 2016, so war was already going on, right, in eastern Ukraine. And she created this project where kids from eastern Ukraine, really right on the front lines of war, worked with kids from western Ukraine. They were all brought to Kiev, where they lived in a dorm together, did a residency with professional playwrights, and wrote plays that told their stories. And then professional actors and directors put the plays on, right? And sort of this one really amazing, beautiful evening performance in Kiev. And it's really interesting because we sort of imagine what kind of kids might write about, but what they actually write about is often very different, right? So it's a really wonderful project. Next slide. Ukraine is also the beautiful Dnipro River. Next slide. Ukraine is also Zaporizhia, which you may have heard about in the very beginning of the war because there was a nuclear power station there that was getting shot. But this is actually a different part of Zaporizhia. This originally was the tallest Lenin in the Soviet Union. And you can see there's no Lenin there now. So in 2015, after the war started, there was this sort of phenomenon called Leninopad or Lenin fall, where people were tearing down their Lenins. So they tore down the Lenin here, but then you can see they kind of didn't really know what to do with it. So they covered it with this sort of weird plasticky Cossack image, and actually are still deciding as a city, what do we do with this square? What do we do with this plinth? Do we just pop someone else up there, or do we sort of rethink the whole social space in general? So really, really fascinating. Next slide, please. Ukraine is also Kherson. This is from a boat ride that I got to go on right outside the city of Kherson, which is in the south. It's currently under Russian occupation. It's very hard because I had a wonderful, I taught at a summer school there, and I just gave about a month ago a talk on Zoom to students at the university in Kherson, and it's under occupation. It was very awkward when you get on the Zoom, you're trying to make the chit chat before the actual lecture starts. And so I was talking to the woman running it, and I was like, oh, it's kind of a dumb question, but how are you? And she was like, well, we're occupied. So I was like, well, they have a sense of humor still. But you can see Kherson is so very, very beautiful. Next slide. Ukraine is also Lehedzina. This is from a village about an hour south of Kiev. These older women here have preserved the local songs throughout the Soviet period, right? So there were a lot of folk songs that were very hard to preserve under the Soviet Union, but they did, and they sort of got together and kept singing them. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have worked really hard to kind of preserve these local songs. And they're at a local party for a local artist, and they're singing these songs. And these are all sort of the homemade foods. We've got a lot of sort of pickled goods around here. They're homemade wine there, which turned out to be very damaging and dangerous. But really, it was a wonderful sort of experience hearing these stories and these songs that these women were singing. Next slide. And this was actually hosted by my friend Amri, pictured here, who runs a language school in Kiev, actually, with which Stetson University has an exchange. And when we send students to Ukraine from Stetson, they study with Amri at this language school. He is currently serving in the army. Next slide. This is my best friend, Sophia. This is us on vacation last year in the Carpathian Mountains. This was before Delta variant, before Omicron, obviously before this invasion. So it was this vacation where we thought, we got through COVID, everything's over, everything's gonna be great. And now, of course, I look back at this picture with such poignant nostalgia. Next slide. And these are the beautiful Carpathian Mountains. May they see peace again soon. So now let me link this very personal narrative with some larger historical context. I am a history professor after all. Next slide. Ukraine. Next slide. So let's start at the beginning. Remember that St. Sophia's Cathedral, that beautiful cathedral. So it was built in the 11th century and was the center of this polity, Kiev and Rus, which you can see is much bigger than Kiev, going all the way from the Black Sea all the way up to what's now Scandinavia. And it was a huge polity unified by this guy Volodymyr in the 10th century. And this cathedral is so sort of famous and such a landmark that even the Bolsheviks didn't want to blow it up, although it's a cathedral, right? So they made it a museum and archives. Kiev and Rus fell to the Mongols in 1240, like much of the region, because they did not submit to Mongol rule. A small princely state in a swamp at that time, Muscovy, made a deal with the Mongols and would rise to become the Russian Empire in 1722. 1722 is actually when Peter the Great says, we are the Russian Empire. So my point is, there's a long history in these lands before Russia. And President Zelensky actually did an Easter address, which you could find on YouTube. It's very beautiful, from the inside of St. Sophia's Cathedral, not only because it's beautiful, but also because it resonates with the past, right? With the past of facing an aggressor, right? And also surviving, right? Kiev survived, the city survived, the buildings survived, and I think Zelensky is suggesting we will survive. Next slide. This is Kiev Mahila Academy, one of the oldest universities in Ukraine. I'm celebrating after a book presentation here, and that is a picture of the university taken from the internet. So this university was founded in the 17th century when Ukrainian lands were a part of a polity called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the early modern period, Poland was really big in Europe. And it was a place of Jews and Poles and Ukrainians, including the Cossacks, who were roaming bands of mercenaries, working the borderlands, living in relative autonomy, working for whichever empire paid the best, until in 1654, when they made a fateful deal with the Russian Tsar and unwittingly signed away their autonomy. Still, much of what is today Ukraine remained part of Poland. You might think, why does this matter? Well, Polish language and culture, the Counter-Reformation, the Baroque, the creation of the Greek Catholic Church, interethnic relations between Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians all deeply shaped this region in specific ways, in different ways than the lands to the north and east that are now Russia, right? So we just see these very different trajectories in these two places. You might pause on the Greek Catholic Church. We're in a church right now, so I can focus on that a little bit. Eastern Rite Easter, as you may know, was last week, a week later than Western Rite Easter that most of us celebrate. And what happened with the Greek Catholic Church was that Orthodox nobles, so people who we would call Ukrainian now, although they probably would not have identified as Ukrainian because nationality had a different meaning, it's a long story. Anyways, Orthodox nobles in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in Poland pushed the creation of a new church in 1596 because they wanted to keep their religious identity, right? That was very important to them. But they also wanted to keep authority and wealth in Poland. So they said, well, we can keep part of our liturgy, but we'll recognize the Pope as supreme. That's fine. So they made this sort of compromised church, the Greek Catholic Church, which is a really, really important story. And more recently, the creation of the autonomous Ukrainian Orthodox Church in 2019 was, scholars say, the biggest watershed in Orthodoxy in half a millennia. So religion's big in this area. You might also pause to think about the Jews. This was an incredibly diverse place. This was where Jews lived in Eastern Europe. And often in conflicts between Ukrainian peasants and Polish nobles, Jews were stuck in the middle. The Bogdan Khmelnytsky uprising in 1648, for example, when Cossacks fought Poles, is remembered as a devastating period in Jewish history. Catherine the Great wiped Poland off the map in the 18th century, and under her rule, ethnic violence broke out again in this region, including what's called the Haidamaki uprising in 1768, another time remembered as sort of freedom fighting for Ukrainians, but devastation and loss for the Jewish community. But this period, interestingly, is also remembered as a golden age of Jewish history, when Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians lived together and apart, in small towns throughout the region, building a multi-ethnic culture, the rituals, traditions, and memories of which traveled to, for example, faraway America when people emigrated. So the Russian Empire is a part of the story of this region, but so is Poland, so is Cossacks, so were Jews, so is the Ottoman Empire. The cultural crossroads of this borderland is specific to this place. Next slide, please. This is the constructivist architectural gem called Держпром, or the government buildings, designed in the 1920s when Kharkiv, which I just told you about earlier, was the capital of Soviet Ukraine. Soviet Ukraine was one of the Soviet republics, right? The USSR was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and one of those republics was Soviet Ukraine. So it was Soviet, but it experienced the Soviet Union in its own way. Next slide, please. Here is, on the right, sort of the gray hair, Les Kurbas, and the bald gentleman in the embroidered shirt in the center is his friend Mykola Kulish, a playwright. So Kurbas and Kulish ran the Berezil Theater, a theater I know very well because I wrote a book about it, creating experimental theater unlike anywhere else in the USSR. Next slide, please. These are two of their shows. On the left, with actors in the boat, is a play called Diktatura, Dictatorship. And on the right is one of my favorites. It's a backstage shot of the guy, Buddy Miller, who did the design, and a bunch of actresses in these sort of ridiculous lighted costume outfits for the first ever Ukrainian musical review called Hello from Radio 477. I can talk about that a lot, but I will spare you. Yet Kharkiv was interestingly also one of the centers of what's called the Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932-33, when at least, lowest level, 4 million villagers died because Stalin raised the grain levels to bend the breadbasket of Europe to his will. Next slide, please. Ukraine is also the Holocaust. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin made a pact, dividing Poland in two. People had the same decisions they've had recently, to stay, to go, which direction. Ukraine was brutally occupied by the Nazis after Hitler invaded, breaking that pact in 1941. In September 1941, for example, when the Nazis got to Kiev, they shot 33,000 Jews in 2 days in a place called Babin Yar. The Russians actually shot a TV tower near Babin Yar in the very early days of the war. World War II, under Nazi occupation in Ukraine, witnessed mass shootings in every town and village, the Holocaust by bullets, as scholars say. Pictured here is a memorial to the Zolota Rosa, the Golden Rose Synagogue, one of the oldest in Europe, in Lviv, which was destroyed by Nazis and its collaborators in 1941. Today, however, a public history project funded by the city has made it a space of contemplation as a new generation tries to weave the lost Jewish past into the civic Ukrainian present. And pictured here, we see the exhibit. They're these sort of rectangular stone blocks meant to look like matzevas or Jewish headstones. And on each block is a quote in multiple languages of a Jewish person who lived in the city, right, from the 16th century to the 20th century. And my friend and colleague Sophia is lecturing about the creation of this project to one of the summer schools of Jewish history and culture. To return to history, liberation from the Nazis began in 1943, but the question was what state would rule these lands? Western Ukraine did not return to Poland, right? It had been part of Poland till 1939. It did not return to Poland, but became part of Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet Union. At the end of war conferences of Yalta and Potsdam, the Western Allies decided to leave Uncle Joe Stalin what he'd taken in 1939, and instead to take part of Prussia and give it to Poland. The borders changed. People were forcibly displaced, shaking a population already traumatized by war even further. From the city of Lviv, for example, right, where this image is from, there were only a handful of Jews who survived. Poles were forcibly deported after the war, and a brutal Sovietization campaign began. And I've been thinking so much about those survivors recently who thought this city would still be Poland, but it became part of the Soviet Union. And I knew intellectually, of course, that that was hard, but I think I know much more now emotionally. In Ukraine, people have lost their homes so many times. Next slide, please. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and there was independent Ukraine. Now, it's challenging to emerge from communism. Suddenly you have a market, you have supply and demand, you have to build rule of law, you don't have a central ideology, and there was a pro-Russian population in Ukraine, people who felt much more comfortable in the Soviet past than the Ukrainian present. But Ukraine voted, actually fairly transparently. Democracy grew. There was a new parliament, a new court system, for example. And revolutions in Ukraine continued to push Ukraine on the path to democracy, including the Orange Revolution in 2004, when blatant disregard of votes brought people out to protest in favor of getting rid of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych in favor of Viktor Yushchenko. In 2010, ironically, votes were cast for Yanukovych, who had been ousted in the previous revolution, but at least votes were cast, right? People's vote mattered. And in 2013, young students got out to protest Yanukovych's statement that Ukraine would never join the EU. And this protest that began with a bunch of students coming out on that central square, Maidan Nezalezhnosti in Kiev, grew and spiraled with a revolutionary dynamic, leading to what's called Euromaidan or Euromaidan, the revolution of dignity until the ouster of Yanukovych in 2014. It seemed like it was done. Then Putin took Crimea in 2014. There was a referendum at gunpoint, and the indigenous population was not allowed to vote. Instead, they were arrested. Then two small regions broke away from Kiev with Russian support, both military and financial, and war began in 2014 in eastern Ukraine. It has not stopped since then. Ukraine has been at war since 2014. Until February 24th, 14,000 Ukrainians died. As you know, the number is now higher. The humanitarian catastrophe is upon us, and this is the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. And Ukraine is on edge. It is fighting not only a physical, but also an existential battle for its existence. And I hope in these few minutes to have shown you that Ukraine exists. And by the photos to show you how it's a part of my world. This is my story too, and the story of all of us who love Ukraine. I want to end with a poem, actually, which I'm going to read in a sort of not excellent English translation, but that's okay. It's one of my favorites. It's by a Kiev native. She's Ukrainian, but she's actually not living in Ukraine right now, Irina Shuvalova. And one of the interesting things that's been happening during this phase of the war is that artists have been extremely active. People are posting sketches, drawings on Facebook every single day, right? Even from bunkers, when they can get a connection, they're posting some images on Facebook. Poets are writing poems, right? Almost every day, something new is coming out on Facebook. And this is one of my favorites. It's called History, Sleeps, and Dreams. When my grandmother told me about herself as an 18-year-old Ostarbeiter, these are Ukrainians who were deported to Germany to work for the German Reich, about herself as an 18-year-old Ostarbeiter in Germany, her stories seemed to me like dreams. In those dreams, strangers in a strange land, taken from far away like cattle in cattle cars, knitted socks from ropes, hung themselves in the greenhouses of German farms, rode bicycles, fell in love. I think that for her, at the time of our conversation, she was in her 70s, it seemed that she must have dreamt it all. The happy French prisoners of war, the rosy-cheeked girlfriends with luscious curls, who after the war she never saw again, who were greedily devoured by the ever-hungry red motherland, and only postcards with rosy-cheeked bourgeois angels written for Anyuta testified to something, bleeding ink into the wooden drawer of the desk. Now, my mom's girlfriend, who in the last few days tore herself out from Brovary through a humanitarian corridor, Brovary is a town near Kiev, she tells us about a woman who seasoned the dinner of the Russian occupiers with rat poison. The Russians who survived razed 10 houses to the ground. About a man shot in his own car who sat there for 3 days. About how, when they ran out of food, they fed themselves with nuts and honey, almost like John the Baptist in the desert. Her stories seem to me like dreams, a shared nightmare from which it's impossible to wake up, in the depths of which restless empires shuffle around, devouring their own children like mythical creatures. In this dream, as in a dense fog, we all stumble around side by side. My late grandma, her curly-haired girlfriends, the German farmers, the rosy-cheeked, big-eyed angels, the man shot near Brovary, the Russian conscripts with bulging eyes and tongues turned blue, and this last one, so young, the nephew of my mom's girlfriend, who was killed on Wednesday in the territorial defense. We rub elbows. We exchange unknowing glances. We eat obediently, spoon after spoon, the thick, bitter darkness. I love this poem because it articulates the emotion of the moment. It reflects the importance of history, the ways that Ukrainians read this war through World War II. And because it's about stories and this strange quality of watching a war, of hearing about a war, when you yourself are sitting somewhere safely, so far away. Next slide, please. Thank you for your attention. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, people always ask me what they can do. First of all, coming to this talk is something that you can do, right? You can learn about Ukraine. You can try to embrace it with your heart and your mind. I think karmically that's a good thing and will help Ukraine to victory. You can donate. I have 3 places I suggest that I know very deeply. The first 2 are humanitarian. Razom for Ukraine is a wonderful organization that's been operating since 2014. They have networks, they have logistics in place. They're doing really good work, focusing right now on tactical medical supplies, tourniquets, the powder that stops bleeding in soldiers, and their supplies are so needed and they can get them to where it needs to go. They're also a US-based organization. It's super easy to donate and you can get a receipt for tax purposes. The next is For Peace, which is a really wonderful, very new organization, very different from Razom. Razom's been around for a while. They got it set up. For Peace was actually founded by a colleague of mine who's a Fulbrighter. This past year, Fulbright Ukraine was evacuated in January when things got really tense with Russia. And with his colleagues in Ukraine, their networks and their networks in Poland, they're doing person-to-person help, right? If someone needs help getting out of a city, they can contact the people who are going to get the car to get that person out. If moms need diapers in Kharkiv, they're going to get organized diapers in Poland and get them across the border and get them to Kharkiv. Certain specific medications, right, they're able to get to people. So they're doing really targeted local work, and they're a new organization, and they're just really, really amazing young people. They're all in their 20s. They're working 24/7. Really, really wonderful. Also very easy to donate. And then finally, at Stetson University, we're engaging in a Ukraine initiative. We're hoping to welcome 4 undergraduates and 1 faculty member to Stetson next year for the academic year, for the entire academic year. We're trying to raise money for tuition, room, board, stipend, everything that refugees would need when they come to a new country. And so obviously, as part of the program and as a professor of Eastern Europe and Russia, I'm deeply involved in trying to raise that money and hopefully welcoming these people to our community, making them feel welcome and making them feel a part of our beautiful Stetson community. So I'm happy to send this slide to Linda if you want to sort of distribute that in the mailing list. And I'm also happy to take any questions during the talking conversation time. Thank you so very much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you.